win at losing. So philosophy, which is not to be confused with philosophy. And to take you through that thinking, we have Gabe Zichermann, who is the chief executive at Failosophy. So Gabe, welcome today, and where are you joining us from today?
Thank you. I'm normally based in Los Angeles, but now I'm visiting my family in Toronto, Canada. So as you can see, Toronto is very tropical, so I have an appropriate background for it.
Exactly, and I do think that is one of the things that a lot of us do during this time, during the pandemic, is this actually to connect with our folks and families. So very important, obviously, to use this challenging time to convene and connect with the people who matter a lot to us. I'm excited to hear a lot more about Failosophy. So Gabe, please enlighten us with what Failosophy can bring to the table.
Sure. Well, thank you, everybody. It's so good to be here, and I've been with the SB community multiple times around the world, including at the main events, and I love being around you because it's very inspiring, all the different work that you're doing, all the different things that you're advancing in the future. And one of the things that I am struck by is how much the sustainability community, the purpose community that you really represent, how much we depend as a society, as human beings, how much we are depending on the work that you do in order to ensure that we have a livable, happy, healthy, good life going forward. And, as somebody who's been an entrepreneur many times, I'll say, in order to do that, in order to really push ourselves forward and try to accomplish, the most that we possibly can, we have to be able to take risks. And you all know that. And much of what you're doing right now is highly, risk-oriented and very, very future-oriented. So I want to talk about what it is that I've learned in this process. And I'll start you off by telling you that, in 2018, in June 2018, I had the worst day of my life, June 4th, terrible. Because on that day, Apple announced the launch of a product called Screen Time, which many of you might be using on your iPhones, or you might be using it on your Android. Google has a similar product. And it's a great thing. It helps you reduce the amount of time you use your devices, but it happened to compete exactly with my startup. So I had gone and built a startup and raised a bunch of money to help people deal with their digital addictions, because I've spent my career working in gamification and behavioral design, and designing systems for changing behavior is what I know. And so I realized that one of the big behavior change issues was using devices. So I invested, very heavily in this business emotionally. I was on 60 Minutes and 2020 and talked to the media and recruited my friends and raised money from people that I knew. And when this startup blew up, one of the things that I kind of realized, or one of the things that I noticed, was that I was equally upset at this startup failing as I had been at my previous failures. I mean, I've started 7 companies, of which 2 have been successes. The jury's still out on 2, and 3 were really big failures. And, now I'm in my mid-40s, and I'm feeling like the first time, like when my project in my 20s, my teens fell apart. And so I realized I, for some reason, hadn't made a lot of progress in how I felt about failure. I was really depressed. I, put all my energy into this. I was, couldn't get out of bed for days. I had suicidal thoughts, like all the different things that happened from a startup, from a project that I didn't been invested in. And yet here I was, not any better at this process, despite having gone through it many times. And so that led me to this weird place where, I think anything I've done for 30 years, anything you've done for 30 years, you're probably better at now than you were when you first started. But somehow I wasn't better at failing. And so it made me ask this question, which is, everybody always says that failure is such a good teacher, that we learn so much from failure, that failure is the best way to experience and learn from the things that happen. And yet, if failure is the best teacher, why does no one ever teach you to fail better? Because I feel like that was never part of my education. I don't know about you guys, but it was, for me, not something that anybody ever taught me how to fail. I was just expected to understand what to do. And I think it goes back, to my childhood. My parents are refugees. I was, born in Canada and grew up here in a great overall environment. But, there was a lot of pressure to be a really, really good student. And in school, I remember my teachers saying things like, you'd raise your hand and make a mistake. And my teachers would say things like, if you don't know the answer, don't raise your hand. You're wasting the class's time, stuff like that. So it's just sort of establishing that failure would be damaging from an early age, and to feel embarrassed about the mistakes that we make. And then I think a lot of people, when they move into professional life, so many of you work for large companies, some of you work for startups, there's this idea that startups are more pro-failure, that they're better at taking risks than large companies. And by and large, we see that being true. But I think there's a connection. The connection is not really about the size of the business. And I've worked for both. I've worked for big companies that were very risk averse and big companies that were very pro risk. And I worked for small companies that were very risk averse and were very pro risk. And what I've come to realize is it's not about the size of the business or even the importance of the project. It's about product market fit. So once a company has established its product market fit, it's very, very unlikely to start taking huge risks with that core business, right? And so this is part of the reason why sustainability transformation is so much harder in an existing company, one with established business processes that are, not super sustainable or questionably sustainable. It's actually harder, not because the organization, and it may be that the organization is resistant to change or afraid of risk, but I think it's more about how well the product marries to the market. And that's something that we have to be really conscious of. We also have to be conscious of this thing called self-enhancing transmission bias. And this is a long word, self-enhancing transmission bias. It's a kind of cognitive bias, but what it really means is that people who are successful or victorious, our business leaders, our entrepreneurs, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, all these folks that we try to emulate, they go back and they change their history to make it look like the setbacks and successes were more strategic. So they actually recast their history. The famous saying, history is written by the victors, and then it's rewritten by the victors. And we have a lot of very famous and very successful people who are not being totally honest about how their setbacks worked and how they are. And I've written a bunch about this, but one of my favorites is Walt Disney, who, we all know is this big success, but Disney's first 2 animation studios went bankrupt. Nobody wanted Mickey Mouse. For years, he was turned down from the studios. He made 3 movies that almost bankrupted the Walt Disney Company, including 2, Fantasia and Pinocchio, that are now considered huge parts of the American cinema, but were at the time the biggest money-losing films of all time. And Disneyland, his theme park, when he first opened, was so controversial that his business, his company forced him out. And that's the reason we have we've got multiple Disney corporations today, is because Walt had to form a separate company because it was considered so risky. So, those facts are known about Walt Disney. They're not secrets. They're not hidden. It's just like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel's conflict. It's not hidden. It's not secret. But if you just look at the official biographies of people, it's not in there. So how are we supposed to, those of us trying to make change, how are we supposed to learn what it takes to be successful at whatever we're doing if the people at the top of the success chain are not being honest about what they went through? And I think this also highlights the fact that we overly look at the successful people and don't really like looking at the failures that have happened as an example of what this can look like. And that, I think, really impoverishes our ability to learn from those experiences because we're so, oriented towards this emulation of success rather than, the embracing of failure. And I think This also is reflected just in our language, the way we speak. Now, I don't speak Turkish, but in English, we tend to present, and I did it at the beginning of this talk, success and failure as opposite situations. So something is either a success or a failure. But one of the things that very high performance people know, and it comes up in the research a lot, especially with sports stars, with athletes, is that success and failure are not mutually opposite states. They're not states that are separated. They're actually coexistent states. And in order to have real success, you have to have failure as a part and parcel, not failure and then recovery and then success. But failure and success coexist, right? Even the best basketball players, the absolute best players in the world, they're able to sink a basket without a problem 1 minute, and the next minute they're missing. 1 minute they're throwing from across the whole floor, and the next minute they're like falling down. They've got 2 left feet. And so you have to allow those things to kind of coexist in your mind in order to really be able to do that. And organizations sort of need to do the same. So I started looking at different companies, organizations, individuals who handled failure differently to sort of bring that together under one idea, which I call Failosophy. So I just want to share with you some of these examples because I think they're really interesting. And the first one that I always point people to is the aviation business. Many of us, and this is important for sustainability, many of us don't remember, but aviation used to be very, very dangerous. There was, my father worked in the business, and until the 1990s, there was 1 fatal Western crash every week on average. So 50 plane crashes a year that approximately had some serious injury or death. And the aviation industry really changed its relationship to this kind of issue by embracing certain aspects of a failure-forward culture. For example, the way that pilots are trained. Think about this. Pilots are put in a pressure cooker simulator regularly to simulate what happens in the event of a failure. And it's tuned so that it's actually really hard for the pilot. Think about most of the training that we do in organizations. Do we train people to be, to constantly fail and learn from their failures? No, we do not. In fact, we try to structure most training so that they're not so hard for people. And that, I think, is a mistake. And one of the other interesting things from aviation that all of us can incorporate is there are international treaties that protect pilots. So after a crash, you crash your plane. After a crash, there are international treaties that protect the pilots from being arrested by the country or territory that they land in. And you might say, okay, well, that's terrible because they should be arrested if they crashed a plane. But there's a reason why the world agreed to not prosecute pilots immediately after a crash. And the reason is that they found that if people were subject to criminal penalty, they would lie about what had happened. And they really needed people to be honest so that they could evaluate and understand what was going on. Because if the pilot and co-pilot agreed to lie about what had happened, it would be harder to figure out what the cause of the crash was and to improve upon it in the future. So in this regard, this kind of need for transparency overrides the, desire for retribution or punishment or whatever. And again, it's something that companies can really embrace. Another example that I love is about KPIs, and it comes from Netflix. So all networks, all broadcasters have what's called a cancellation rate, which is the percentage of shows in every season that are canceled, right? So it's a percentage, shows we launch, shows we cancel, cancellation rate. At most broadcast networks, that KPI, the ideal number for that KPI is 0. So all shows would be successes with the customer, and we would not have to cancel any of the shows. But at Netflix, founder Reed Hastings has often said that he believes that if that number is too low, so if that number was 0, that they're not taking enough risks, that they're not trying to push the envelope enough with their content that they're creating. And so to a great extent, that KPI, the success or failure KPI for their broadcasting, it's actually managed not down towards 0 failure, but managed up towards more risk-taking, because they understand that that is important for creating, new content and new ideas and solving new problems. And of course, Netflix has been the best performing, tech company and certainly stock of the last 20 years. And there's a reason for that, and it's about innovation. And so their innovation culture is very interesting. Also, some global multinational companies have started doing what's called the Dare to Try program. Tata, Pfizer, a number of other business, Intuit. And what this Dare to Try program is, it's incredible for those of you who manage teams. Every year you do like a ceremony, usually of some kind, get everyone together and say, the best people, blah, 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 was this. The most exciting thing that happened this year was that. And what Dare to Try does is it says that when you're doing that awards ceremony internally, that recognition ceremony, that you also elevate the people who have tried to do something that was important but didn't succeed at doing it. And you elevate them and you put them on the same platform. So you've got the prizes for the best project of the year, and you've got the prize for the best attempt of the year. And the prizes are the same. The money, the recognition, the response from the organization, they're uniform. And the reason is we've got to fight against people's, lack of desire to fail and to take risks. And so these organizations recognize, like Netflix, you've got to manage against people's fear of failure that they might have learned in childhood. And the last thing I will say as we wrap up, the last thing I'll talk about is portfolio theory. And portfolio theory is an important concept that investors understand that the average person does not understand. And it's very complicated math, understanding how portfolios work. But the concept is that whenever an investor builds makes a set of investments, build a portfolio of investments, they're trying to maximize the risk and return for the appropriate level of risk and return that they would like. So whatever return they need, they've got to optimize the risk for it. So, the best way to think about this is a venture capitalist investing in 10 companies, okay? So a venture capitalist normally invests in 10 companies and assumes that 6 will lose all of their money. 3 will need more capital, maybe return the capital they put in, but probably not give them much. And 1 will be a unicorn that just blows up and, makes all the money for the entire portfolio across the 10. Most lay people, most of us in industry, we look at that and think, okay, well, if I want to raise returns, I need to move the dead companies up the ladder towards the high performers. But what professional investors understand is that if you do that, you lower the expected return of the portfolio. And so what you need to do is not try to make the companies that aren't working or the projects that aren't working successes. What you need to do is identify the opportunity for unicorns as quickly as you possibly can, lean into that really hard, and push all of your capital, all of your energy, all of your attention into those leaders, into those unicorns as quickly as you possibly can, and not get worked up about the rest. So you remember the company that I talked about, Onward, which was the screen time company that failed. I remember calling my lead investor and talking to the CFO, and I was going to tell him, like, look, I don't think we're going to make it. We don't have enough money. We're going to run out of capital. And I was expecting him to be really upset. And the phone call was literally me calling up and saying, hey, I think we're going to run out of capital and we're not going to make it. And he was like, okay, well, do you have any money to send back to us? And I was like, I don't think so. And he was like, okay, well, no problem. Talk to you soon. Shocking, right? If you lent money to a friend or you invest in a project, you'd probably be really upset under those circumstances, really disappointed. That's not how they reacted, because what they were identifying was that in that moment, our company was not going to be the unicorn. And as soon as they knew that we were not going to be the unicorn, all they wanted to do was minimize the time they spent trying to keep us going. And so I think these items together, these things that we put together, managing the KPIs up, thinking about, the self-enhancing transmission bias, understanding where we come from, pushing the envelope, recognizing people who take risks, and, also expressing our thoughts in portfolio theory, expressing our, risk tolerance by looking at not one project, but multiple projects and using them as a testing ground to identify what can happen. These things together constitute what I call a Failosophy, which is a view of how to be successful by embracing failure. And I'll leave you with this last thought. If you yourself are not currently in the process of considering a failure, so if in your life right now you cannot see a failure ahead of you for the projects that you're working on, you are not taking enough risks. You are not pushing yourself as hard as you can, or as hard as you should, or as hard as the world needs. Failure is a state that must constantly be right in front of us, and we have to learn to adapt to that and embrace it. And I think by following Failosophy and understanding how people have done it successfully, not being distracted by people who lie about their history, but being focused on the actual mechanical ways, you can help contribute to a better life for all by taking appropriate and smart risks that will change the game in sustainability. And I didn't freeze, by the way. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for opening our eyes towards what the Failosophy can bring, and also by sharing your own personal and very frank story about things that I think all of us should talk much more openly about, things like anxiety, stress, and all of these things. I can definitely, in my own work, recognize the idea about taking risks, and it's something that I try to push my creative teams towards each and every day, because if you want to do creative work, if you want to do great creative work, you've got to take risks, and you've got to accept that in that process you fail as well. One quick little advice for all of the people in the audience, just boil maybe down to one sentence. How do you fail great?
Yeah, I think what the most important thing for failing well, I think, is to accept up front that everything that you're doing is probably going to fail. Not if, and therefore you're pushing yourself in the right way. So if you are taking the right level of risk, it's something that you feel engaged with, you take personally, you want to be successful, but you accept that may not be the one success that changes the whole world, that you might have to iterate.
Great advice, Gabe, and do get back to your family in Canada, and thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom in a very frank and honest way. Thank you so much.